Before we dive into this presentation, please be advised that it contains themes of psychological suspense and an unsettling mystery that some listeners may find intense. Listener discretion is advised. Imagine spending 30 years of your life underground, navigating a labyrinth of steel and darkness, carrying thousands of souls through the beating heart of a city that never sleeps. You learn every curve, every rumble, every whisper of the tracks. You think you've seen it all. But what if, on your very last run, the tracks whisper back a secret so profound, so terrifying, it shatters everything you thought you knew about reality? What if the last passenger you picked up wasn't alive at all? This is the story of Michael, a man who dedicated his life to the subway, only to find himself trapped in a nightmare where the line between the living and the dead blurred with every screech of the train. Michael was a New York City subway conductor, a lifer. He'd seen the city evolve from behind the glass of his control booth, from the bustling morning commutes to the eerie, deserted stretches of track in the dead of night. For Michael, the subway wasn't just a job. It was his second home, a predictable, rhythmic world where he was in control. He was just 3 shifts away from retirement. 3 shifts from trading the deafening roar of the tunnels for the quiet hum of a fishing boat he'd bought upstate. He'd earned it. 30 years without a single incident, a perfect record. His colleagues, guys like David, the grizzled dispatcher with a permanent coffee stain on his uniform, would joke that Michael could drive the trains blindfolded. And they weren't wrong. He knew the lines like the back of his hand, the subtle shifts in vibration that signaled a loose track, the unique echo of each station. But the predictability, the comforting routine was about to shatter. It began subtly, as these things often do. It was a Tuesday night, late shift, the kind where the city exhales and the trains become sparsely populated metal serpents slithering through the dark. Michael was on the A line, heading north, the familiar drone of the motors a lullaby. The train was mostly empty, a handful of commuters scattered across the cars, lost in their phones or the quiet contemplation of the late hour. As he pulled into the Fulton Street station, a quick glance at his monitor, which displayed the interior of each car, caught his eye. In the third car from the front, seated alone by the window, was a woman. Nothing unusual about that except for how she was sitting. Perfectly still, almost rigid, her head slightly bowed, long dark hair obscuring her face. Her clothes seemed a little out of time, a muted floral dress that looked more suited to a faded photograph than a bustling subway car in the modern era. He dismissed it as a quirky passenger, perhaps a tourist. He continued his run. Chambers Street, Canal Street. Each time he checked the monitor, she was still there, in the same seat, same posture. It was odd but not alarming. People rode the subway in all sorts of ways. Then at West 4th Street, a major transfer hub, a small group of passengers boarded and exited. Michael did his routine check, scanning the cars. The woman was still there. He mentally shrugged. Maybe she was going all the way to Inwood. It wasn't until the 59th Street Columbus Circle station, a much busier stop, that a flicker of unease sparked in Michael. He watched a young couple get off, laughing, and then instinctively, his eyes went to the third car. The woman was gone. Vanished. He hadn't seen her move, hadn't seen her get up or exit. He rewound the internal camera feed in his mind, trying to recall if he'd seen her stand. Nothing. He distinctly remembered her being there just moments before. He frowned, a tiny wrinkle forming between his brows. Maybe she just moved to another car. Or he simply missed her getting off in the rush. It happened. He finished his shift that night, the incident a faint, almost forgotten blip in the monotony. He went home, ate a microwave meal, and fell asleep to the distant wail of sirens, the city's constant lullaby. The next night, Wednesday, was his second to last shift. He felt a mix of anticipation and melancholy. He was on the same line, the A train, but a slightly earlier run. The train was busier, but as the evening wore on and the crowds thinned, a familiar sense of quiet descended. As he pulled into the 34th Street Penn Station stop, the monitor flickered. And there she was again. Third car from the front, same seat, same rigid posture, head bowed, dark hair. The same floral dress. Michael felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. This was too precise. He watched her for a full minute, a strange creeping sensation crawling up his spine. She didn't move. Not an inch. Passengers walked past her, oblivious, some even brushing her arm briefly as they found seats. Yet she remained frozen. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to see her up close, to confirm. He waited until the train was between stations, then, against protocol, he put the train in neutral and stood up, grabbing his flashlight. He walked through the first 2 cars, his heart thumping in irregular rhythm against his ribs. The first car was empty. The second car, a sleeping homeless man huddled in a corner. As he approached the door to the third car, a wave of icy cold air washed over him. Even though the train's climate control was functioning perfectly, he pushed the door open. The car was bathed in the dim, flickering light of the tunnel outside. Empty. Completely and utterly empty. The seat where he'd seen her was vacant, the window beside it reflecting only the passing concrete walls. Michael stood there, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, his breath misting in the sudden chill. His mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. A reflection? A trick of the light? But the monitor image had been so clear, so distinct. He even remembered the pattern on her dress. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silent car. He ran his hand over the fabric of the seat where she'd been. Cold. Unnaturally cold. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of disbelief. This was ridiculous. He was just tired, stressed about retirement, old age catching up. He spent another minute sweeping the car with his light, checking under seats, behind pillars. Nothing. Embarrassed by his own irrationality, Michael returned to his cab, his composure rattled. He tried to rationalize it away, chalking it up to fatigue and an overactive imagination. But the image of her, so still, so out of place, was seared into his mind. He found himself constantly checking the monitor, a nervous habit forming. He didn't see her again for the rest of that shift. But the unsettling feeling persisted, a cold residue clinging to his thoughts. That night he barely slept. Every creak of his old house sounded like the groan of a subway car. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a woman with bowed head. He tried to talk himself out of it, to convince himself it was nothing. But the cold seat, the sudden chill in the empty car, those were real. They weren't just in his head. His last shift, Thursday. He woke up with a sense of dread instead of the usual excitement for retirement. He forced himself to go, to finish what he started, to get through these last few hours. The subway, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. He was on the same line, late run again. The A train heading downtown this time. He felt a prickle of anticipation, a morbid curiosity mixed with pure fear. Would she be there? He avoided looking at the monitors for the first few stops, trying to focus on the controls, on the familiar rhythm. But the urge was too strong. Finally, just past 125th Street, he couldn't resist. He glanced at the monitor for the third car. Empty. He sighed, a shaky breath escaping him. Relief washed over him, quickly followed by a strange sense of disappointment. Maybe it had just been his imagination. He continued his run, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He was almost free. He was almost done. He was pulling into 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal, a deep underground station, when a sudden jarring jolt ran through the entire train. Not a mechanical jolt, but something resonant, like a massive bell had been struck deep within the earth. The lights in his cab flickered violently, then steadied. He checked his gauges, everything seemed fine. No loss of power, no emergency brakes. He looked at the monitors again, a nervous habit now. This time he didn't even have to search. In the first car, right behind his cab, visible in stark, terrifying detail on the screen, was the woman. But this time she wasn't sitting. She was standing, facing directly towards the camera, towards him. Her head was still bowed, her long dark hair falling forward, but there was a subtle tilt, an unnatural angle, as if she were peering through the screen. And then slowly, impossibly, her head began to lift. Michael felt his blood run cold, every hair on his body standing on end. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He was frozen, staring at the monitor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The flickering fluorescent lights of the tunnel outside seemed to mock him, casting long dancing shadows. Her head continued to rise, agonizingly slow. He could almost hear the creak of her neck, a sound that wasn't there but filled his mind. The dark hair parted, revealing a face he couldn't quite make out, shrouded in shadow, yet undeniably focused on him. And then from the speaker in his cab, the crackle of static, followed by a faint breathy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A single word, barely audible over the rumble of the train, yet piercing the silence of his cab like an ice pick. Michael. His name. Spoken by something that shouldn't exist, from a car that should be empty. Michael screamed, a raw primal sound that was swallowed by the metallic roar of the train. He slammed his hand down on the emergency brake, the sudden violent lurch throwing him forward, but he didn't care. He had to stop. He had to get out. Because whatever was in that first car, it knew his name. And it was no longer just watching. It was coming for him. The train howled, a tortured metal shriek that tore through the tunnel, vibrating through Michael's bones even as he braced himself. He slammed against the control panel, the impact jarring his teeth, but the pain was a distant echo drowned out by the primal terror roaring in his ears. The air was thick with the smell of burning brakes, acrid and suffocating. The entire carriage shuddered violently, then with a final sickening lurch, it ground to a complete, absolute halt. Silence. Not the usual hum of the subway, nor the distant rumble of other trains. Just an oppressive, heavy stillness that swallowed the echoes of the screech, leaving only the frantic thumping of his own heart. Michael gasped, his lungs burning, desperately trying to pull air into them. He pushed himself upright, his hands trembling so violently he could barely keep his grip on the console. His eyes darted to the mirror, but there was nothing now. Nothing but the inky blackness beyond the first car, stretching into the tunnel. No, that wasn't right. He'd seen it. He'd heard it. It knew his name. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the adrenaline. He had to get out. Now. His fingers fumbled for the door release, a small red lever near the floor. His hands were slick with sweat, making it difficult to grip. He cursed under his breath, yanking at it, his muscles screaming with effort. The door hissed open, a sudden burst of sound that made him jump. He scrambled out of the cab, not even bothering to look back. The tunnel air was damp and cold, a stark contrast to the stuffy cab. He was on the narrow catwalk, just a few feet of concrete between the train and the rough-hewn wall of the tunnel. The emergency lights, dim and infrequent, cast long, distorted shadows that danced with every tremor of his racing pulse. He didn't know where he was exactly. Somewhere between stations, deep underground. He pulled out his radio, his hands still shaking. Dispatch. Dispatch, this is train 307. Michael Vance, conductor. Emergency stop. I repeat, emergency stop. He tried to keep his voice steady, professional, but it cracked on the last word, betraying the raw fear that clawed at his throat. A crackle of static, then a calm, even voice. 307, this is Central. We show you stop between Astor Place and Bleecker Street. What's your status, Michael? Report condition of passengers and equipment. The voice was Sarah, one of the night dispatchers, always unflappable. Sarah, I don't know the condition of the passengers. I haven't checked. I had to stop. There was something in the first car. I saw it. It was looking at me. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, trying to articulate the impossible. It called my name, Sarah. It was in the first car, and it started coming for me. Silence from the radio, a more deliberate, confused silence this time. Then Sarah's voice, tinged with a hint of concern. Michael, are you all right? Are you feeling unwell? Did someone breach the cab? No, no one breached the cab. It wasn't a person, Sarah. Not a living person. It was a shadow, a presence, and it was in the train. It's still here, I think. He gripped the radio so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had to sound convincing. This wasn't a prank or a breakdown. This was real. Michael, I need you to calm down. There's no record of any unauthorized personnel on your train. Have you been drinking? Are you experiencing a medical emergency? Her voice was softer now, gentler, the kind of tone you use with someone who might be losing their mind. That stung. He wasn't crazy. He knew what he saw. I'm not drunk, Sarah. And I'm not sick. I'm telling you, there's something on this train. Something impossible. I pulled the brake because it was coming for me. I swear to God. He risked a glance back at the train, the long dark steel serpent stretching behind him. The emergency lights inside the cars were on, casting a faint, sickly yellow glow through the windows. He couldn't see anything specific, just empty seats, rows and rows of them, stretching down the length of the first car. But the feeling, the oppressive weight, the cold dread was still there, emanating from the first car like a poison. Michael, I'm going to need you to return to your cab. We're sending a maintenance crew and transit police to your location. This is a secure line, but I need you to be rational. What did you see?" Sarah's voice was firm again, but the underlying worry was still audible. "I can't go back in there, Sarah. Not yet. I saw the figure. Tall. Thin. It was standing at the very front of the first car, just staring. And then its head tilted, and it spoke my name. It wasn't a voice, not really. More like a whisper in my mind, and it started to move towards the cab. I couldn't let it get in." He shuddered, the memory vivid and terrifying. He took a step, then another, moving away from the front of the train, deeper into the tunnel. The catwalk was narrow, and the occasional pipes and conduits running along the wall forced him to squeeze past. He could hear the faint, distant hum of the city above, a reminder of the normal world, a world he felt utterly disconnected from right now. "Michael, you need to stay calm. We're dispatching help. You said you haven't checked on your passengers. You need to do that. It's protocol." Sarah's voice was a lifeline, a tether to reality, but it was asking him to do the impossible. "There are no passengers in the first car, Sarah. I checked the cameras. And the other cars? I don't know. I just know I can't go back into the first car. Not with that in there." He stopped, leaning against the cold, grimy tunnel wall, trying to catch his breath. The air felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on him. He felt an intense, undeniable chill, despite the exertions of his escape. It wasn't just the tunnel's inherent coldness. This was a deeper, more profound cold, a presence that seeped into his bones. He heard it then. Faint, subtle, a rhythmic, almost imperceptible scrape, like something being dragged or slowly scuffed across the floor. It was coming from inside the train, from the first car. His blood ran cold. It wasn't confined. It was moving. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's still in there. I can hear it. It's moving." "Hear what, Michael? Just hold tight. Help is on the way. Just stay put. Don't go anywhere." Her voice was urgent now, a hint of alarm finally seeping through her professional calm. He couldn't stay put. Not with that sound. Not with that feeling. The scrape was growing louder, more distinct. It sounded like it was approaching the door of the cab, the very door he had just fled through. He pushed off the wall, his legs shaking, and started to move faster down the catwalk, away from the train. His flashlight, clutched in his left hand, bounced erratically, illuminating patches of grime, discarded trash, and the occasional scurrying rat. He didn't care about the rats. He cared about what was behind him. The scrape stopped. Michael froze, his breath hitched in his throat. The sudden cessation of the sound was almost worse than the sound itself. It implied it had stopped at something, or for something. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to listen, to decipher the silence. Was it waiting? Was it watching? A low guttural thump reverberated through the tunnel, shaking the very air around him. It came from the train, from the first car. It sounded like something heavy had just hit the floor. Then a faint, almost inaudible click. The sound of a door unlatching. His eyes snapped open. The door to the first car, the passenger door that led onto the catwalk, was slowly, deliberately swinging inward. It moved with a smooth, silent grace that was utterly unnatural. No wind, no sudden jolt, just a slow, inexorable opening into the dim, yellow-lit interior. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. He could see nothing immediately inside, just the empty space, the rows of seats. But the cold, the oppressive presence intensified, washing over him in a wave. It was like standing at the mouth of a freezer, but instead of cold air, it was pure dread that assaulted him. He wanted to scream, to run wildly, but his feet felt glued to the concrete. His mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. A faulty latch? A draft? No, this was too deliberate, too slow, too knowing. Then from the darkness beyond the open door, a single elongated shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom and stretched out onto the catwalk, reaching towards him. It wasn't a shadow cast by light. It was a shadow made of darkness, a deeper void in the dimness of the tunnel. It seemed to writhe, to stretch, growing longer, thinner, as if pulled by an unseen force. He stumbled backwards, his foot catching on a loose piece of concrete, sending him sprawling. His radio clattered out of his hand, bouncing off the wall and landing with a dull thud in the grime-filled drainage ditch running alongside the catwalk. The light from his flashlight, still clutched in his hand, spun wildly as he fell, momentarily illuminating a grotesque, distorted reflection of his own terror in the grimy puddles. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his knee. The shadow was still there, stretching, reaching. It felt like a physical touch, a cold tendril of pure malice brushing against his skin. He could almost hear the whisper again, not in his ears but directly in his mind, a chilling echo of his own name. He had to get away from the train, away from the shadow, away from whatever impossible horror lurked inside. He started running, stumbling, his breath tearing in his throat, not looking back. He could feel its presence, a cold, silent pursuit that needed no footsteps to convey its relentless approach. The tunnel stretched endlessly before him, a suffocating dark maw, but he knew one thing for certain. It was safer to be lost in the darkness than to be caught by the ghost passenger on his last run. He could still hear the faint, distant crackle of Sarah's voice from the radio he'd dropped, calling his name, but it was fading, becoming just another sound lost in the terrifying, all-consuming silence of the tunnel. He was alone, and it was still coming. He was alone, and it was still coming. The realization hit Michael like a physical blow, stripping away any vestige of control or rational thought. The distant, fading echo of Sarah's voice was the last tether to sanity, and now even that was gone, swallowed by the suffocating darkness and the terrifying, relentless sound that was advancing. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a growing chill that seeped into his bones, an invisible weight pressing down on the air around him. Panic, raw and primal, seized him. His legs, stiff from the cold and the shock, screamed in protest, but he forced them to move. He scrambled, not running in any coherent direction, but simply fleeing from the unseen horror behind him. The uneven concrete beneath his feet became a treacherous enemy, each step a gamble. He stumbled, catching himself on the grimy wall of the tunnel, his hands scraping against the rough, cold stone. He could taste the metallic tang of fear in his mouth, feel the frantic drumming of his heart against his ribs. The sound, that omnipresent, chilling whisper, seemed to intensify with his flight. It wasn't a human voice, not exactly. It was more like the rustling of dry leaves, or the slithering of something impossibly large across a forgotten crypt, mingled with something that sounded eerily like a sigh, stretched and distorted by the tunnel's acoustics. It was everywhere and nowhere, a symphony of dread that played directly into his deepest fears. He risked a glance over his shoulder, peering into the inky blackness, but there was nothing to see. Only the oppressive, absolute void where the tracks stretched back towards his abandoned train. Yet he felt it. He felt the cold breath on the back of his neck, the sudden drop in temperature that prickled his skin, raising goosebumps despite the exertion. He had to hide. There was no outrunning this. Not in this labyrinthine darkness. He squinted, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom. Up ahead, perhaps 50 yards, he thought he saw a darker patch against the already dark wall. An alcove? A maintenance access panel? Anything. It was a desperate hope, but it was all he had. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, the taste of rust and dust filling his mouth with every ragged gasp. The whispering seemed to quicken, to gain on him, and he imagined spectral fingers brushing his back, a formless shadow reaching out. His mind screamed, telling him to keep running, even as his body threatened to give out. Finally, he reached the alcove. It wasn't much, just a recessed section of the tunnel wall, barely wide enough for him to squeeze into, designed for workers to step aside when a train passed. It was choked with dust, cobwebs, and the discarded detritus of decades of forgotten maintenance. A rusty wrench, a torn plastic sheet, a scattering of dead leaves somehow carried in by the wind. He wedged himself into the small space, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. He held his breath, straining his ears, his entire being focused on the sounds around him. The tunnel was a symphony of drips and echoes, the distant rumble of the city above, the occasional metallic ping of the tracks cooling. But beneath it all, he could still hear it. The whispering, the rustling, slowly, agonizingly drawing closer. Past his hiding spot. Or did it? He couldn't be sure. The sound seemed to swirl around him, to eddy and flow like an unseen current. He felt a profound, bone-deep cold wash over him. A cold that wasn't just physical, but seemed to permeate his very soul. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the terror, to convince himself this was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. He tried to rationalize. What could it be? A stray animal? A rat the size of a small dog disturbed by his presence? But the sounds, the feeling, it was too deliberate, too malevolent for an animal. Person then? A homeless person, perhaps living in the tunnels, disoriented or dangerous. But the subway system was supposed to be secure, regularly patrolled. And the way it moved, the way it sounded, it wasn't human. It was something else. Something ancient and wrong. Minutes stretched into an eternity. His muscles began to cramp from holding the rigid position. He waited, listened, his heart still hammering against his ribs, but slowly, the intense chill began to recede. The whispering sound seemed to fade, becoming distant again, swallowed by the vast, cavernous silence of the tunnel. Had it passed? Was it gone? He cautiously opened his eyes, peering out from his cramped sanctuary. The darkness was still absolute, but the immediate sense of oppressive dread had lessened, replaced by a lingering unease. He risked a slow, shallow breath, then another. He was still alive. For now. He couldn't stay here. He had to keep moving to find a way out. He remembered the emergency exits, the small green-lit doors that led to street level, usually every half-mile or so. He'd never paid them much attention during his runs, always focused on the tracks, the signals, the schedule. Now, the thought of one of those glowing green signs was a beacon of desperate hope. Carefully, he began to extract himself from the alcove, his limbs stiff and protesting. As he shifted, his foot nudged something hard. He looked down, squinting, trying to make out the object in the faint ambient light that seemed to filter in from nowhere. It wasn't a rock or a piece of discarded equipment. It was something metallic, glinting dully in the gloom. He bent down, his fingers trembling slightly, and picked it up. It was a locket. Old, tarnished brass, intricately engraved with swirling, floral patterns that had long since worn smooth in places. It felt heavy in his palm, cold and ancient. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and after a moment it sprang open with a faint click. Inside, nestled behind two cloudy, yellowed pieces of plastic, were two faded photographs. On one side, a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with kind eyes and a faint, hopeful smile, her hair styled in a fashion that looked decades old. On the other, a man older with a stern but gentle expression, his uniform suggesting he was a railway worker, perhaps even a conductor from a bygone era. A wave of profound sadness washed over Michael. This wasn't just a forgotten trinket. This was a piece of someone's life, lost in this desolate tunnel. The photos, the locket itself, radiated a quiet despair, a sense of belonging to a forgotten tragedy. Who were these people? How did this locket end up here, in this obscure alcove untouched for so long? Was it connected to the ghost passenger? The thought sent a fresh shiver down his spine. This wasn't just a random haunting. It felt personal. He closed the locket, the weight of it in his hand feeling suddenly heavier, imbued with the sorrow of its past. He couldn't leave it here. It felt wrong, a final insult to the memory of its owners. He slipped it into his pocket, the cold metal pressing against his thigh. Just as he did, a new sound cut through the silence. Not the whispering, not the rustling. This was different. A low guttural growl, impossibly deep, that reverberated through the very ground beneath his feet. It wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. And it wasn't behind him. It was ahead. He froze, his heart seizing in his chest. His eyes darted into the darkness, but still, there was nothing. Only the echo of that monstrous sound, seeming to emanate from the very fabric of the tunnel itself. He had been so focused on what was behind him, on the pursuit, that he hadn't considered the possibility of something waiting for him ahead. Then a flicker, a faint, almost imperceptible movement in the oppressive darkness, like a ripple in still water. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. It was too tall, too gaunt, a shadow that seemed to absorb the already scarce light. It wasn't moving, not exactly. It was there, a towering, impossibly thin figure, barely discernible against the blackness, standing directly in his path. The growl came again, louder this time, tinged with something that sounded like ancient, simmering rage. Michael's breath hitched. He finally saw it, or enough of it to know that whatever stood before him was not human. It was skeletal, draped in tattered remnants of what might have once been a uniform, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And its eyes, he couldn't see eyes, but he felt their burning intensity, a cold, malevolent gaze that pierced the darkness and locked onto him. He was trapped, the whispering horror behind him, and this skeletal sentinel blocking his only way forward. He could feel the cold radiating from the figure, a palpable wave of despair and fury. It was waiting for him, and it was undeniably terrifyingly real. Terrifyingly real. Michael felt a primal scream clawing at his throat, but no sound escaped. His muscles locked, every nerve ending screaming a warning. The skeletal figure, impossibly thin, its tattered clothes hanging like cobwebs from bone, was utterly silent. No breath, no rustle, just an ancient, suffocating stillness that radiated an agony so profound it felt like a physical blow. Its eyes, hollow pits of shadow, seemed to bore into his very soul, not with malice, but with an overwhelming, desolate grief. A silent accusation. Behind him, the whispers intensified. No longer just a murmur, but a chorus growing louder, more distinct. "He didn't help?" they hissed, 1,000 icy breaths against his neck. "Left us alone." The words were fragments, broken shards of despair, and they were aimed directly at him. Michael's mind raced, a desperate scramble for an explanation, a way out of this impossible nightmare. He tried to take a step back, but another wave of cold, more intense this time, emanated from the space behind him, pushing him forward. He was caught, pinned between two unspeakable horrors. The skeletal figure remained impassive, a sentinel of sorrow, its gaunt form absorbing the meager light, casting an even deeper shadow. Then he noticed something. A faint metallic glint clutched in its bony hand. A small, tarnished silver locket. It was barely visible, almost swallowed by the oppressive darkness, but it was unmistakably there. The sight of it, so incongruous and delicate amidst the horrifying tableau, triggered something deep within him, a forgotten memory, a buried echo from a past he had long preferred to leave undisturbed. It was a memory from years ago, when he was just starting out as a motorman, still fresh-faced and full of the naive optimism that the city's underbelly hadn't yet fully extinguished. He remembered the chatter in the break room, the hushed tones, the grim faces of the older conductors. A young woman, a passenger, had vanished. Not simply disappeared, but truly vanished from their line. It was a case that had haunted the transit authority for months, then years, eventually fading into the realm of urban legend, whispered about during late-night shifts and shared over stale coffee. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She was a student new to the city, taking the late train home after an evening class. She was last seen at the 14th Street station, just a few stops before the end of Michael's current route. No witnesses, no struggle, just a sudden impossible absence. The police had scoured the tracks, the tunnels, the station cameras. Nothing. It was as if the subway itself had swallowed her whole. Michael remembered the details because he'd been on that very train, though not the conductor of her specific car. He'd heard the reports, seen the posters. A bright, hopeful face smiling out from a faded flyer. A stark contrast to the grim reality of her disappearance. He remembered the general consensus among his colleagues. A runaway, a suicide, or perhaps she'd simply gotten off at another stop and they'd missed it. They'd wanted to believe in a rational explanation, anything to avoid the chilling implication of the alternative. But deep down, a chilling unease had always lingered with Michael. There was something about the absolute lack of evidence, the way she had simply ceased to exist, that defied all logic, all human understanding. He recalled one old motorman, a grizzled veteran named George, who had insisted it wasn't natural. George had spoken of the hunger of the tunnels, of things that lurked in the darkness between stations, things that occasionally took a toll, claiming a soul here, a life there, feeding on the despair and forgotten corners of the urban labyrinth. Michael had dismissed it as old-timer superstition, a morbid way to cope with the inexplicable, a tale spun to add drama to the monotonous grind of the night shift. But now, standing before this skeletal figure, with the whispers clawing at his sanity, George's words echoed with terrifying clarity. No longer superstition, but a chilling premonition. The locket. That was it. The flyer. Sarah Jenkins had always worn a distinctive silver locket, a treasured gift from her grandmother, often mentioned in the missing persons reports as a key identifying feature. He remembered seeing a blurred image of it in a newspaper article, a small detail that had stuck in his subconscious. It was the same locket, tarnished and ancient, now held by this spectral guardian. The connection slammed into Michael with the force of a speeding train, a horrifying revelation that ripped away the last vestiges of his disbelief. This wasn't just a ghost. This was her ghost, or something inextricably connected to her. The skeletal figure wasn't just a random specter. It was a manifestation of Sarah, or perhaps a protector, a witness to her final terrifying moments. As this horrifying realization dawned on him, the skeletal figure slowly began to move. Its head, a bare skull devoid of flesh, tilted almost imperceptibly, and its hollow eyes seemed to fixate on the locket in its hand, tracing its outline with a silent, profound sorrow. Then slowly, agonizingly, its gaze lifted to meet Michael's once more, a silent plea in its empty sockets. The whispers behind him coalesced, becoming almost a single guttural voice, filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow, a collective moan of forgotten souls. "He saw everything," it rasped, the words vibrating through the very metal of the train, through Michael's bones, chilling him to the core. "He watched her fade." Michael's blood ran cold. Who was he? Was it referring to him, Michael, standing there, a conductor on the same line years later? Or someone else, someone involved in Sarah's disappearance? The skeletal figure, Sarah, slowly raised its other hand, not to threaten but to point. Its bony finger, long and accusing, didn't point at Michael but past him, towards the very source of the whispers, towards the darkness that pulsed with unseen horror at the far end of the car, where the light seemed to die, swallowed whole by an encroaching void. It wasn't blocking his way forward anymore. It was showing him where to go, or perhaps what he needed to confront. The horror behind him, the whispering entity, was something else entirely, and Sarah, or whatever remained of her, wanted him to face it. Michael felt a jolt of terror, followed by a surge of desperate, bone-deep resolve. The skeletal figure was not an aggressor, but a guide. A silent, terrifying guide leading him deeper into the heart of the nightmare. He had two choices: succumb to the paralyzing fear, to let the whispers consume him and the figure trap him, or follow the bony finger into the abyss, towards the source of the whispers and the unspeakable truth about Sarah Jenkins. His breath hitched, a ragged gasp in the suffocating silence. He had to know. He had to understand what had truly happened all those years ago, what dark secret this subway line harbored, and more importantly, he had to survive it. His breath hitched, a ragged gasp in the suffocating silence. He had to know. He had to understand what had truly happened all those years ago, what dark secret this subway line harbored, and more importantly, he had to survive it. Michael stared at the screen. The name Sarah Jenkins burned into his mind like a brand. It was a common name, yes, but the context, the date, the specific car number, it couldn't be a coincidence. This was his lead, his first real tangible clue in a nightmare that had been steadily consuming his life. The cold dread that had been his constant companion now mingled with a fierce, almost desperate resolve. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to dig, to uncover, to rip away the veil of mystery. His first thought was to search the MTA's internal archives. As a conductor, he had a certain level of access, but anything from decades ago, especially something potentially sensitive, would be deeply buried. He couldn't just type Sarah Jenkins' ghost into the system. He needed a more subtle approach, a way to sift through the digital dust without raising any alarms. He started with general incident reports from the approximate time frame the log entry suggested, the late 1970s, pages and pages of mundane equipment malfunctions, minor passenger injuries, track work delays. Nothing that screamed spectral entity causing derailments. He spent hours that night, long after his shift ended, hunched over his personal laptop, cross-referencing dates, specific lines, and even old newspaper archives he could access online. The public record was sparse. There were mentions of a minor incident on the A train line around that time, a disruption of service due to an unforeseen track issue, or a small electrical fire. The language was always vague, almost deliberately so. No mention of fatalities, no detailed passenger manifests, certainly no Sarah Jenkins. It was as if the event had been carefully scrubbed, leaving only the barest, most innocuous traces. The more he searched, the more frustrated he became. It was like trying to catch smoke. Every time he thought he had a lead, it dissolved into nothing. The MTA, a behemoth of bureaucracy, was excellent at documentation, but also at burying anything that might tarnish its image. He realized he needed an insider, someone with deeper institutional memory, someone who might have heard whispers, or had access to the really old physical files that hadn't been digitized. There was only one person who came to mind: David. David had been with the MTA for over 40 years. a grizzled veteran whose knowledge of the subway system was encyclopedic. He knew every crack in the tunnels, every forgotten sightings, every urban legend. Michael knew David was a gruff man, not one for idle chatter, but he also had a surprising soft spot for history, especially the undocumented kind. The next day, Michael sought David out during their lunch break. He found him in the cramped staff room, nursing a lukewarm coffee and scowling at a crossword puzzle. "Hey, David," Michael began, trying to keep his voice casual. "Got a minute?" David grunted, not looking up. "Depends. You gonna ask me about the new schedule changes? Because I already told them it's a disaster waiting to happen." "Nah, nothing like that," Michael said, pulling up a chair. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I was actually wondering about something historical. You know, old stories from the line." David finally looked up, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Historical? What, you suddenly fancy yourself an urban archaeologist?" "Something like that," Michael chuckled, a forced sound. "I was looking through some old maintenance logs just out of curiosity, and I saw a reference to car number 217. You know, the old model. And it got me thinking. There was a faint mention of some kind of incident back in the late 70s. Nothing specific, really vague. You ever hear anything about it? Back in your early days?" David narrowed his eyes, stirring his coffee slowly. "Car 217, huh? That's a relic. Most of those were retired, scrapped years ago. Real death traps, those old beauties. Fast though." He took a sip, then leaned back, a faraway look in his eyes. "Late 70s, yeah, I remember. Barely. I was just a rookie then, mostly sweeping platforms and learning the ropes. But everyone talked about it for a while. The brass tried to keep it quiet, of course." Michael felt a jolt of anticipation. "Keep what quiet?" "The derailment," David said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Not a big one, not like the news reports would have you believe. They called it track misalignment or some such PR nonsense. But it was more than that. It was on the A line, just past the 145th Street station, heading north. Late night run, almost empty." "What happened?" Michael pressed, his heart pounding. This was it. Supposedly a mechanical failure. Axle snapped, car jumped the tracks. Nothing too dramatic, no big pileup. But there was a fire. Small, contained, but enough to cause some real damage. And enough to make things complicated. David paused, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. "They said it was an accident. Always an accident, right? But the whispers were different." "Whispers?" "Yeah, people said there was a passenger. One passenger in that specific car. A young woman. And she just vanished. Never found her. Not a trace." David finally met Michael's gaze, a grim expression on his face. The official story was that she must have been incinerated beyond recognition. Or maybe she panicked and ran off into the tunnels and got lost. But no one really believed it. Not really. They searched for weeks, brought in divers for the river sections, everything. Nothing. Michael's blood ran cold. A young woman. Vanished. Car 217. It all clicked into place with horrifying precision. "Do you remember her name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. David scratched his chin, thinking. Been a long time. It was a common name, I think. Sarah something. Jenkins? Yeah, that sounds right. Sarah Jenkins. The confirmation hit Michael like a physical blow. It wasn't just a random name from a phantom log entry. It was real. Sarah Jenkins was real. And she had vanished from car 217 in a mysterious incident the MTA had tried to cover up. They just gave up searching? Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eventually, David shrugged. Declared her presumed dead. Case closed. But it left a bad taste in everyone's mouth, especially because of how the incident happened. There were rumors that the conductor on that train, a guy named Robert Miller, he swore up and down that something wasn't right. That he saw things moving in the tunnel before the derailment. Said it wasn't just a broken axle. Things. Michael repeated, a chill snaking down his spine. Yeah, he got transferred off the line pretty quickly after that. Said he was having a nervous breakdown. Funny how that happens when you start asking too many questions. David took another sip of coffee, then looked at Michael with a knowing glint in his eye. Why all the interest in old Sarah Jenkins, Michael? You heard some of the ghost stories, haven't you? The ones about the A-line. Michael swallowed hard. He couldn't lie, not entirely. I've had some strange experiences on that line, David. Things I can't explain. And that name, Sarah Jenkins, it came up in a very unsettling way. David nodded slowly, his expression serious. Thought so. That deep section of the A line, it's always been active. Some say it's because of the old burial grounds it cuts through. Others say it's the sheer amount of human emotion that's passed through those tunnels over the decades. But after that derailment, after Sarah Jenkins disappeared, it got worse. Conductors started reporting cold spots, flickering lights, strange noises. Some even claimed to see a figure, a woman, moving through the empty cars or standing on the tracks just out of reach. A woman in a conductor's uniform? Michael asked, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. David frowned. Uniform? No, not usually. Just a regular woman. But sometimes they say she's wearing something dark, something that looks like an old-style MTA uniform. But that's usually just the really freaked-out guys talking. Most just say it's a woman looking lost or angry, always near car 217, or where it used to be. Michael felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The uniform detail was crucial. It wasn't just Sarah Jenkins, the vanished passenger. It was her, the entity that had been tormenting him, the one in the conductor's uniform. Why would she appear as a conductor if she was a passenger? Was she trying to send a message? Or was it something far more sinister? So the official report blamed a mechanical failure, Michael mused aloud. But the conductor, Robert Miller, he thought something else was going on. And Sarah Jenkins vanished without a trace. Never found. Exactly, David confirmed. It was all very convenient. A neat little package to close the books. But anyone who worked that line knew better. They just learned to keep their mouths shut if they wanted to keep their jobs. He looked at Michael, his eyes holding a warning. You start poking around in old MTA secrets, especially the ones they tried to bury, you might find yourself in trouble, Michael. This system has a way of silencing things it doesn't want heard. Michael knew David was right. He was already deep in trouble, deeper than David could possibly imagine. He wasn't just looking for an old ghost story. He was living it. The entity wasn't just a legend. It was a malevolent force actively trying to harm him, to stop him. He thanked David, his mind racing. He had a name, a date, a car number, and a credible eyewitness account of a cover-up. But the pieces still didn't quite fit. Why was Sarah Jenkins, a passenger, appearing as a conductor? And why was she so angry, so powerful? The official story of a simple derailment and a missing person felt hollow. A flimsy curtain drawn over a much darker truth. He knew what he had to do next. He couldn't rely on official channels anymore. He needed to find whatever Robert Miller had seen, whatever evidence had been suppressed, whatever truth lay beneath the concrete and steel of the A line. And he knew with a chilling certainty that his next step would involve going back down into the depths of the subway, back to the silent, watchful darkness, and confronting the ghost of Sarah Jenkins face to face. He had a name now, but the true story of the subway conductor's last run was only just beginning to reveal its terrifying secrets. The name Sarah Jenkins echoed in Michael's mind like a phantom bell, ringing with both terror and a strange, compelling urgency. He had a name now, a lead, a fragile thread connecting him to the spectral passenger haunting his life in his subway car. Sleep was a distant, unwelcome concept. The moment he was off duty, his mind raced, not to rest, but to the cold, hard facts that might be hidden somewhere in the city's forgotten archives. His apartment, usually a sanctuary, now felt like a temporary holding cell, a place to gather his thoughts before plunging back into the mystery. He started with the obvious, the digital rabbit hole of the internet. Sarah Jenkins. The name felt plain, common, yet imbued with an extraordinary significance for him. He typed it into search engines, adding keywords like subway, disappearance, accident, New York City. Page after page loaded, filled with countless Sarah Jenkinses, a sea of unrelated lives. He refined his searches, adding conductor, train, station 113, the station where he first encountered the full force of the phenomena. Nothing. The digital world, usually so eager to reveal, remained stubbornly silent on the Sarah Jenkins he sought. Frustration gnawed at him, a dull ache behind his eyes. He spent hours, the blue light of his screen reflecting in his weary gaze, before the realization dawned. If Sarah Jenkins was a ghost from years past, her story might predate the easily searchable digital age. He needed to go deeper, to the physical annals of history, to the dusty microfilm readers and yellowed newspaper clippings. He needed the public library. The next morning, or what felt like morning after a sleepless night, Michael found himself in the hushed, cavernous silence of the city's main public library. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the subway. He made his way to the local history and archives section, a quiet corner where time seemed to slow, where the past lay preserved in countless microfiches and bound volumes. A kind, elderly librarian with spectacles perched on her nose, a woman named Eleanor, guided him to the microfilm readers. "Anything specific you're looking for, dear?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur. Michael hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. "I'm researching local urban legends, specifically those connected to the subway system. I heard a name, Sarah Jenkins, might be involved in an old incident." Eleanor's brow furrowed slightly. "Sarah Jenkins? I don't recall that name coming up often. Most of our subway lore involves the Mole People or the Phantom Express. But I can show you how to navigate the archives. We have city newspaper records going back over a century." He thanked her, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. This was it. He sat down at a machine, the cold metal clinking as he loaded the first reel. Years blurred past on the small screen, a dizzying scroll of headlines, advertisements, and forgotten stories. He searched chronologically, starting 5 years prior, then 6, then 7. His eyes burned, scanning for any mention of the name, any hint of a tragedy, a disappearance, a connection to the subway. Hours bled into one another. The library emptied and refilled, the sunlight outside shifting from bright morning to a muted afternoon glow. His back ached, his eyes felt gritty, and doubt began to creep in. Had he been wrong? Was the name just a trick of his mind, a figment of his fear? Then, just as he was about to give up, his fingers numb from turning the reel, a headline flickered into view, stark and chilling against the grainy background. It was from a local paper, dated precisely 5 years and 2 months ago. "Art student vanishes. Subway connection suspected in Sarah Jenkins' case." Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. The world outside the microfilm screen seemed to recede, replaced by the flickering monochrome image. This was her. This was the name. His heart hammered against his ribs as he adjusted the focus, leaning closer, devouring every word. The article detailed the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins, a 22-year-old art student from the Pratt Institute. She was described as bright, vivacious, with a passion for urban sketching, often seen with a worn leather-bound sketchbook. Her last known whereabouts? She was seen entering the turnstiles of Station 113, the very station. Witnesses recalled seeing her around 11:30 p.m., waiting for a downtown train, her usual route home after a late-night shift at a coffee shop near campus. The police investigation, led by Detective Thomas Miller, had yielded no substantial leads. Her apartment was undisturbed. Her friends and family insisted she was not the type to run away, especially without her beloved sketchbook, which was also missing. The official theory, the article stated, leaned towards a tragic accident, a fall onto the tracks during a late-night commute, perhaps after nodding off or being disoriented. The subway system's vastness and the speed of the trains meant a body might never be recovered, particularly if it was struck and dragged. But the article also hinted at unease. Sarah's best friend, a woman named Emily Chun, was quoted, her words dripping with disbelief. Sarah was meticulous, always aware of her surroundings. She never drank, never did drugs. The idea of her just falling, it doesn't make sense. And she would never leave without her sketchbook. It was her life. Michael felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This wasn't just a random ghost. This was Sarah Jenkins, a real person, a student with dreams, whose disappearance was shrouded in mystery. And it happened at his station 5 years ago, around the same time of night he often worked. He continued to scroll, finding follow-up articles, each one painting a grimmer picture. The search was eventually scaled back, the case growing cold. A final article, 6 months after her disappearance, mentioned the family's quiet despair, the police closing the active investigation, ruling it an unrecoverable accident or a voluntary disappearance, despite the family's protests. But then Michael found it. A small, almost throwaway paragraph in a later, less prominent article, buried deep within a local news roundup about city safety improvements. It mentioned a minor detail from the initial police report, a witness who had contacted authorities shortly after Sarah's disappearance. A homeless man, known to frequent Station 113, had claimed he saw Sarah arguing with someone on the platform that night, just before her train arrived. He described the other person as a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark, nondescript uniform, possibly a transit worker, though he couldn't be sure. The report stated the witness was deemed unreliable due to mental instability and a history of substance abuse, and his account was dismissed. A transit worker, a dark uniform. Michael's blood ran cold. He thought of the phantom conductor he sometimes saw in his peripheral vision, the chill that accompanied the apparition. Could it be? Could the ghost not be Sarah but someone else, someone connected to her disappearance? Or was the ghost Sarah, and she was trying to show him something about that night? He reread the paragraph, his mind racing. Why was the witness dismissed so easily? Was it truly unreliable, or was there a motive to suppress that particular detail? A transit worker. The very people who ran the subway, who knew its hidden passages, its blind spots. A shiver traced its way down Michael's spine, not just from the cold of the library, but from a deeper, more primal fear. He was no longer just a conductor experiencing strange phenomena. He was now inextricably linked to a 5-year-old cold case, a missing person, a possible murder. And the ghost of Sarah Jenkins, if it was indeed her, was trying to tell him something that the city, the police, and time itself had conspired to bury. As he closed the microfilm reader, the silence of the library felt heavier, more oppressive. The image of Sarah Jenkins, vibrant and full of life in the old newspaper photo, was seared into his memory. He had a name, a face, and a tragic story. But the official narrative felt incomplete, hollow. The dismissed witness, the missing sketchbook, the family's gut feeling. These were threads that pulled at the edges of the tidy explanation. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his journey into the depths of the subway, back to the silent, watchful darkness, was far from over. He had to find out what truly happened to Sarah Jenkins. He had to find that homeless witness if he was even still alive. He had to confront the terrifying secrets that Station 113 still held, secrets that Sarah's restless spirit was desperately trying to reveal. And as he walked out of the library, the city lights twinkling like watchful eyes, he felt an undeniable presence beside him, a cold breath on his neck, as if Sarah herself was guiding his every step, urging him onward, deeper into the truth. The cold breath on his neck lingered, a phantom touch that sent a shiver down Michael's spine, not of fear but of profound connection. Sarah was with him, a silent co-pilot in this desperate hunt for truth. The city hummed around him, a symphony of indifference, but for Michael, every shadow held a secret, every distant siren a warning. He clutched the printouts from the library to his chest, the weight of them feeling far heavier than paper and ink. What he'd uncovered was a forgotten corner of the city's history, a tragic footnote dismissed as an unfortunate accident. 12 years ago, almost to the day, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins had died at Blackwell Station. The official report stated she had fallen onto the tracks as a train, operated by conductor David Miller, pulled into the station. David had been cleared of any wrongdoing, the incident chalked up to a tragic misstep, a moment of inattention on Sarah's part. But the archived newspaper article Michael held, a follow-up piece from a tenacious local reporter, painted a different, unsettling picture. It spoke of inconsistencies, of eyewitnesses who claimed they saw Sarah arguing with someone just moments before her fall, their testimonies mysteriously downplayed or outright ignored in the official investigation. It hinted at a missing purse, never recovered despite extensive searches. Most chillingly, it mentioned a frantic phone call Sarah had made just an hour before her death, to a friend, whispering about something she discovered, something dangerous, something that involved the very fabric of the city's underground. The article speculated, carefully, about foul play, but the trail had gone cold, the reporter eventually transferring out of state, the story fading into the city's collective amnesia. Michael's eyes scanned the final paragraph of the feature, a detail that had leaped out at him like a neon sign in the dark. Sarah Jenkins, the article noted, had been on her way to an old, abandoned apartment building on Elm Street, just a few blocks from Blackwell Station. She had apparently been clearing out her grandmother's belongings, a task she'd been putting off for months. Her friend, the one she'd called, remembered Sarah mentioning she might have found something important among the old keepsakes, something she needed to verify before telling anyone. That was the last time anyone heard from Sarah. The pieces began to click into place with a horrifying precision. David Miller, the conductor, was on duty that night. He was the one who had seen Sarah last. Was he involved? Or was he another victim, silenced or coerced into complicity? The thought gnawed at Michael. He remembered the phantom passenger, the fleeting glimpse of a woman on David's last run. Was that Sarah, eternally replaying her final moments, trying to show him what truly happened? Michael hailed a cab, the address for the Elm Street apartment building burning in his mind. The ride was a blur of neon and exhaust, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots. If Sarah had found something dangerous and she was on her way to verify it, then her death wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. And if it was a cover-up, then someone had gone to great lengths to silence her, and perhaps years later to silence David Miller too. The taxi dropped him off on a desolate stretch of Elm Street. The old apartment building stood like a skeletal sentinel against the bruised sky. Its windows dark, many of them broken, like vacant eyes staring into the void. A condemned sign, faded and peeling, was nailed to the front door. The air here was heavy, still, devoid of the city's usual restless energy. It felt like a place where time had stopped, where secrets lay buried under layers of dust and neglect. Michael pushed open the heavy, creaking door. The hinges shrieked in protest, the sound echoing through the cavernous, silent lobby. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, mildew, and forgotten memories. Moonlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting long, distorted shadows that danced as Michael moved. He pulled out his phone, the flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The main power was clearly off. He found the old directory board, its names mostly scratched out or faded beyond recognition. Sarah's grandmother's apartment number, as mentioned in the article, was 3B. The stairs groaned under Michael's weight as he ascended, each step a testament to the building's age and abandonment. Every creak, every rustle of wind outside, sent a jolt through him. He was acutely aware of his solitude, yet the feeling of Sarah's presence remained, a cold comfort urging him onward. He reached the third floor. The hallway was a labyrinth of closed doors, some ajar, revealing glimpses of empty, stripped-out rooms. He found apartment 3B. The door was slightly ajar, not forced, but as if it had been left that way, perhaps by Sarah herself 12 years ago. He pushed it open slowly. The apartment was small, a single bedroom and a living room, both eerily empty save for a few forgotten items. A broken lamp lay on its side in the living room, a dusty armchair overturned. It looked like someone had ransacked the place, but not recently. The dust was thick, undisturbed for years. Michael's heart sank. Had he come all this way for nothing? Had whatever Sarah found been taken long ago? He meticulously scanned every inch of the small space. He checked under the loose floorboards, behind the peeling wallpaper, inside the rotting kitchen cabinets. Nothing. Just the ghosts of what once was. He was about to give up, a wave of exhaustion and disappointment washing over him, when his gaze fell upon a small, built-in bookshelf in the corner of the living room, mostly empty, its shelves sagging. He ran his hand along the dusty planks, his fingers brushing against a loose panel at the very back of the lowest shelf. It wasn't obvious, almost perfectly camouflaged by years of grime and neglect. With renewed hope, Michael pried it open. Behind it, nestled in a dark, narrow cavity, was a small leather-bound journal. It was old, its cover worn, but surprisingly intact. His hands trembled as he pulled it out. This had to be it. Sarah's journal, the one she was on her way to verify. He flipped it open, the brittle pages releasing a faint, musty scent. The elegant script within was undeniably Sarah Jenkins. The first few entries were mundane, everyday observations, thoughts on her grandmother's life, memories of childhood. But as Michael delved deeper, the tone shifted. The entries became more urgent, more paranoid. Asterisk October 14th. I found it, tucked away in Grandma's old chest. A stack of old transit documents, maps, maintenance schedules, and correspondence. Not just any correspondence. Letters from a man, a city official, to Grandma's cousin, who worked for the transit authority decades ago. They talk about modifications to the old lines, secret tunnels, and a special cargo that was moved through them. Asterisk. Michael's breath hitched. Special cargo? Secret tunnels? This was far more than an accident. Asterisk October 20th. I've been trying to make sense of it. The dates, the coded references. Seems impossible. A network beneath the city, hidden in plain sight. They were using the old disused tunnels for something. And Grandma's cousin, he was part of it. He was worried, wrote about wanting to expose it. But he disappeared shortly after these letters stopped. Asterisk. The entries grew more frantic, the handwriting less steady. Asterisk October 25th. I saw him. Conductor David Miller. He was at the old Blackwell maintenance yard late at night. With others. They were moving something. Large crates. Onto a train. Not a passenger train. A service train. I hid, but I saw enough. It's real. The letters were real. The special cargo is still being moved. And David, he's involved. Asterisk. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the abandoned building. David Miller. The conductor. He was part of it. But was he a willing participant or a pawn? The final entry, dated October 27th, the day of her death, was barely legible, scrawled in a panicked hand. Asterisk. They know I know. I confronted David. He looked terrified. He said it was bigger than us. That I had to run. He gave me something. A key. For a locker at Union Station. He begged me to take it to someone named Arthur. He said I had to expose them for both of us. But they're coming. I hear them. They're here. God help me. Asterisk. The entry ended abruptly, smudged as if the pen had been dropped in haste. A key. David had given her a key. For a locker at Union Station. And a name Arthur. This was David's attempt to help her. A desperate act of defiance. He hadn't just been a conductor that night. He had been a man caught in a web trying to save Sarah and perhaps himself. Michael stared at the journal, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Sarah wasn't just a victim. She was a whistleblower. And David was complicit, yes, but also a potential ally trying to fight back. He had tried to get the truth out, and it had cost him everything. As Michael carefully closed the journal, a faint, almost imperceptible click echoed from the doorway of the apartment. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of the door, which he'd left ajar, slowly, silently closing. Michael froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't alone. And the presence he felt now wasn't Sarah's guiding spirit. It was something else entirely. Something cold, calculating, and very, very real. Michael froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't alone. And the presence he felt now wasn't Sarah's guiding spirit. It was something else entirely. Something cold, calculating, and very, very real. A strangled gasp caught in his throat. He spun, his eyes frantically scanning the gloom-shrouded interior of the abandoned subway car. The clank of the door had been so quiet, so deliberate, it felt less like an entrance and more like a trap snapping shut. The air, already stale and heavy with the scent of rust and damp concrete, now seemed to thicken, pressing in on him. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to writhe, to coalesce into something menacing. He could hear his own ragged breathing, loud in the profound silence, a frantic drumbeat against the ominous stillness. "Who's there?" Michael's voice, when it finally emerged, was a raw whisper, barely audible even to himself, betraying the terror coiling in his gut. He took a hesitant step backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the rusted metal frame of a broken seat. His fingers closed around cold, rough steel, offering a sliver of imagined defense. Out of the deeper shadows, nestled between two rows of decaying seats towards the far end of the car, a figure began to emerge. It wasn't a sudden dramatic reveal, but a slow, deliberate materialization, as if the darkness itself was shedding a skin. A man. He wasn't particularly tall, but his frame was broad, solid, suggesting a lifetime of hard work or perhaps something more sinister. He wore a dark, nondescript jacket that seemed to absorb what little ambient light there was, and a worn baseball cap pulled low, obscuring most of his face. But even in the dimness, Michael could feel the intensity of his gaze, a predatory focus that sent a shiver down his spine far colder than the subway air. The man didn't speak. He didn't even acknowledge Michael's question. He simply took a step forward, then another, his movements slow, measured, utterly relentless. Each footfall was soft, almost soundless on the grimy floor. Yet it resonated in Michael's chest like a death knell. There was no aggression in his posture, no visible weapon, just an unnerving certainty, an unhurried determination that was far more terrifying than any overt threat. He moved like a hunter who had cornered his prey and knew there was no escape. Michael's mind raced, a frantic scramble of fear and adrenaline. He was trapped. The car was long and narrow, a metal coffin on wheels. He glanced desperately at the door he'd just entered, but it was now firmly closed, a solid barrier of steel. The windows were opaque with grime and age, offering no view and no escape. He was utterly alone with this silent, menacing stranger. "What do you want?" Michael tried again, his voice gaining a desperate edge, though it still trembled. He tightened his grip on the broken seat frame, mentally weighing its usefulness as a weapon. It was heavy, unwieldy, but it was something. The man continued his slow advance, now only a few yards away. As he drew closer, Michael could make out the harsh lines of his face beneath the cap. A square jaw, a grim set to his mouth, eyes that seemed to hold an ancient, weary anger. This wasn't a random mugging. This was personal. This man had been waiting. Suddenly, without warning, the man lunged. It wasn't a wild, untrained attack, but a swift, powerful surge forward, a practiced movement. Michael, propelled by sheer terror, reacted on instinct. He swung the piece of metal from the seat, a clumsy, desperate arc. The improvised weapon connected with the man's arm, a dull thud that echoed in the confined space. The man grunted, a low, guttural sound, but he didn't falter. His momentum carried him forward, and he slammed into Michael, driving the air from his lungs. They tumbled backward into the narrow aisle between the seats, a tangle of limbs and desperate struggles. Michael fought with every ounce of his strength, kicking, flailing, trying to break free. The man was surprisingly strong, his grip like iron. He was trying to pin Michael, to silence him. The air filled with the sounds of their struggle, grunts, heavy breathing, the clatter of Michael's makeshift weapon as it flew from his grasp and skittered across the floor. Michael felt a sharp pain as his head hit the edge of a seat. Dazed for a moment, he saw stars, but the cold, hard reality of his situation snapped him back to full awareness. He had to get away. He bucked and twisted, managing to create a small distance between them. Scrambling to his feet, he backed away, his eyes darting for an escape, any escape. The man, now standing upright, adjusted his cap. His face was still grim, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, frustration, perhaps, or a renewed resolve. He finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floor of the train. "You shouldn't have come down here, Michael. Some things are better left buried." Michael froze, his breath hitched. The voice was calm, controlled, utterly devoid of emotion, making it all the more chilling. He knew his name. This wasn't a random encounter. "Who are you?" Michael demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. His back pressed against the grimy wall of the car, nowhere left to go. The man took another slow step forward. "My name is Frank, and I'm the one who cleans up messes." His gaze bore into Michael. "You're just like her, you know, Sarah. Too curious. Didn't know when to stop digging." The name hit Michael like a physical blow. Sarah. This man knew Sarah, and his words implied a deep, sinister connection to her disappearance. "What did you do to Sarah?" Michael's voice was raw with a sudden, searing anger, momentarily eclipsing his fear. Frank let out a low, humorless chuckle. "What did I do? I just tried to keep things quiet, like I'm trying to do now." She stumbled onto something she shouldn't have. Something big. Something that could unravel a lot of very important operations down here. Operations? Michael's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments. What operations? What are you talking about? Frank stopped just a few feet from Michael, his presence looming. "The tunnels, Michael. These abandoned lines. They're not just empty spaces. They're a network. A lifeline for certain discrete movements. Goods, information, people. It's been running for decades, right under the city's nose. The perfect cover." He gestured vaguely around the dilapidated car. "And the stories, the ghost passenger, the old conductor's last run. They just keep people away, keep them from seeing what's really happening down here. The legends are good for business." A cold dread settled over Michael, far deeper than any fear of a mere ghost. So the ghost passenger wasn't a supernatural entity at all. It was a carefully crafted lie, a macabre smokescreen designed to protect a vast, illicit network operating in the forgotten veins of the city. Sarah hadn't been chasing a phantom. She'd been uncovering a conspiracy. "Sarah found out," Michael whispered, the realization dawning on him, horrifying in its clarity. "She saw something. She knew." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes glinting in the gloom. "She was close. Too close. And you, Michael, you followed her trail right to the source. You know too much now. Just like her. The implication hung heavy in the air, a chilling promise of a similar fate. Michael felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate instinct for survival. He couldn't let Frank get him. Not after coming so far, not after learning the horrifying truth. He saw his chance. Frank had closed the distance, confident in his victory. Michael noticed a faint flicker of light from an emergency exit sign further down the car, almost imperceptible. With a sudden, desperate lunge, Michael ducked under Frank's outstretched arm, slamming his shoulder into the man's midsection with all his might. Frank grunted in surprise, stumbling backward. Michael didn't wait. He sprinted, a blur of motion in the oppressive darkness, towards the far end of the car, towards the faint light. He burst through a connecting door, flinging it open with a desperate shove, and plunged into the absolute, suffocating blackness of the tunnel beyond. He heard Frank's enraged roar behind him, followed by the heavy, determined thud of footsteps. Michael was running blind, through a labyrinth of concrete and steel, with a cold-blooded killer hot on his heels. He had learned the truth, but it might be the last thing he ever learned. Every breath was a gasp, every heartbeat a drum against his ribs. Michael stumbled, his hands scraping against the rough concrete walls, the metallic tang of fear thick in his mouth. The air in these forgotten passages was heavy, smelling of damp earth, rust, and the faint, acrid scent of ozone from the live tracks that hummed unseen nearby. He could hear them, those deliberate, unhurried footsteps closing in. There was no panic in their rhythm, only a terrifying certainty, a predator's patience. He ducked into a narrow alcove, pressing himself against the cold, grimy wall, trying to control his ragged breathing. The footsteps paused just beyond his hiding spot. Michael squeezed his eyes shut, a desperate prayer forming on his lips. Then they moved on, the sound fading slightly as his pursuer continued down the main path, seemingly having missed him. He waited, counting to 20, then 30, before cautiously peeking out. The tunnel was empty, save for the oppressive darkness. Michael pushed himself forward again, not running now, but moving with a desperate, silent urgency, his mind racing through the fragments of information he'd pieced together. The truth. He had found it, buried deep within David's personal locker, behind a loose panel in the back. It wasn't just a journal, but David's own meticulously kept, unofficial logbook, detailing what the official reports had deliberately omitted. David, it turned out, hadn't just vanished. He had been murdered, and the ghost passenger Jessica wasn't a spectral entity from the afterlife in the way Michael had initially imagined, but a victim, a tragically real person whose death had been brutally suppressed. David's logbook laid it all bare, in his frantic, increasingly desperate handwriting. It had happened months ago, late one night. A high-speed test run on a newly upgraded track section. The train, pushed beyond its safety limits, had malfunctioned, veering slightly off its intended path, or perhaps the signal system had failed. Whatever the precise cause, there was an impact. David, on a nearby maintenance vehicle, had heard it, felt the tremor, and rushed to the scene. What he found was horrific. A young woman, Jessica, had somehow been on the tracks. Whether she had fallen or been pushed, or was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, David couldn't determine. But she was there, and the train had struck her. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of frantic communication, not about rescue, but about containment. A high-ranking official, whose name was redacted in David's log but clearly referenced, had arrived on the scene within minutes, before emergency services could be properly notified. Orders were barked. Clear the scene, remove all evidence, silence any witnesses. The incident was to be classified as a routine track inspection, and Jessica's body, devastatingly, was to be disposed of, her disappearance later attributed to her simply leaving the city, a runaway. David, a man of integrity, was horrified. He had tried to report it, to expose the cover-up. He'd made official inquiries, filed internal complaints, meticulously documenting everything he'd witnessed, including the identity of the official orchestrating the cover-up. He believed in justice, even for a passenger whose existence was now being erased. But his efforts were met with stonewalling, threats, and eventually a more permanent solution. His logbook detailed the increasing pressure, the veiled warnings, until one entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, spoke of a final confrontation. David had recorded a meeting with the official, where he was given an ultimatum: drop it or disappear. David refused, and then silence. His last entry was a plea, a desperate hope that someone someday would find his logbook and expose the truth. He even theorized that Jessica's spirit, if such things existed, might be trapped, seeking justice, trying to guide someone to the truth. That's why Jessica had appeared to Michael, not as a malevolent ghost, but as a lingering echo of a terrible injustice, a guiding light in the darkness, trying to lead him to David's hidden truth. She was the spectral embodiment of an unsolved crime, a forgotten victim, and the official who orchestrated the cover-up, the one David had tried to expose, was still active, still powerful, and still willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. Michael now knew the identity of that official. The moment he found the logbook, a name, scrawled in the margins of one of David's earlier, less guarded entries, had leaped out at him. It was a person David had once trusted, a mentor almost. And it was the same person who had been so seemingly helpful to Michael in his own investigation, subtly redirecting him, offering cryptic advice that now, in retrospect, seemed designed to test his resolve or throw him off the scent. It was Robert. Robert, the veteran conductor, the one who had shared stories, offered warnings, and always seemed to be just a little too curious about Michael's progress. Robert wasn't just a witness to the cover-up. He was the enforcer, the one who carried out the official's dirty work, the one who had murdered David and staged his disappearance to protect his own career, his own complicity. He wasn't just covering for someone else. He was deeply, personally involved. He had been there that night, helping to dispose of the evidence, and then later silencing David. The realization hit Michael with the force of a physical blow. Robert hadn't been guiding him. He'd been monitoring him, a spider watching its prey, waiting for the moment Michael got too close to the web center. And that moment had come. Michael had found the logbook. He knew. And now Robert was hunting him. He rounded a bend, the tunnel opening into a vast, echoing cavern, a junction point where multiple tracks converged, unused and decaying. The air here was colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that made the hair on his arms stand up. Overhead, colossal concrete beams crisscrossed, supporting the weight of the city above, creating a dizzying skeletal canopy. Going somewhere, Michael? The voice, calm and even, echoed from the darkness behind him. Michael froze, his blood turning to ice. Robert. He hadn't heard him approach. Michael slowly turned, his heart hammering against his ribs. Robert emerged from the shadows, a silhouette against the faint glow filtering from distant service lights. He held something in his hand, a heavy wrench, its head glinting dully. There was no anger on his face, no malice, just a chilling, detached resolve. "You really shouldn't have gone digging, kid," Robert said, his voice resonating in the cavernous space. "Some things are best left buried." "Jessica, David," Michael stammered, his voice hoarse with fear and adrenaline. "You killed David. You covered it all up." Robert sighed, a sound of weary resignation. David was an idealist, a good man in his own way, but he couldn't see the bigger picture, couldn't understand the necessity of certain sacrifices for the greater good of the authority, for the city. He gestured vaguely with the wrench. "One life, Michael. One unfortunate incident, easily explained away. But a full-blown scandal? Millions in lawsuits, careers ruined, public trust shattered? That's a catastrophe. David was going to cause a catastrophe. So you killed him?" Michael's voice rose, laced with disgust. "I ensured his silence," Robert corrected, his eyes cold and unwavering. "A necessary measure, just as I'll ensure yours." He took a step forward, the wrench held loosely at his side. "You found the logbook, didn't you? That's why you ran. Foolish. You should have just walked away when you had the chance. You could have had a long, uneventful career here, Michael." "What about Jessica?" Michael pressed, trying to buy time, searching frantically for an escape route in the vast, confusing space. Did she just appear on the tracks? Or was she put there? Robert's expression remained impassive. Irrelevant now. What matters is that her death, and David's subsequent actions, threatened everything. And now you threaten it too. He took another step, closing the distance. "It's a shame, Michael. You have potential. But you're too much like David. Too much conscience. That's a dangerous trait in this line of work." Michael backed away, his gaze darting around. The cavern was a maze of defunct machinery, discarded tracks and shadowed alcoves. There had to be a way out. A ladder, a hidden passage, anything. "You won't get away with this," Michael said, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. Robert chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed eerily. "Oh, I think I will. I've done it before, haven't I? The subway is vast, Michael. It has a way of swallowing people whole, especially those who wander too far off the beaten path." He raised the wrench slightly, a casual, menacing gesture. "Now, let's not make this any harder than it has to be. Come quietly, and it'll be quick." Michael didn't respond. He saw it. A narrow, dark opening in the far concrete wall, barely visible behind a stack of rusted pipes. It looked like a ventilation shaft, too small for Robert's broader frame, but potentially just wide enough for Michael. It was a desperate gamble, but his only hope. As Robert lunged forward, wrench swinging, Michael dove, narrowly avoiding the blow. He scrambled towards the opening, his heart pounding like a drum solo. He heard Robert curse, followed by the heavy thud of his boots as he gave chase. Michael reached the opening, squeezing through the tight gap, the rough concrete scraping against his clothes and skin. He could hear Robert's furious grunts as he tried to follow, but he was too big. "You can't hide forever, Michael." Robert's voice boomed from the cavern, distorted by the narrow shaft. "This entire system is my home. You're just a visitor." Michael crawled deeper into the suffocating darkness, the air growing stale and close. He couldn't see anything, but he could hear the distant, ominous rumble of an approaching train, a deep vibration that shook the very foundations of the tunnel. He was trapped in a confined space, with a killer behind him, and an unknown powerful force hurtling towards him from the front. He was running out of time and out of options. His mind screamed. His body tensed. He had mere seconds. The roar of the approaching train was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical assault, a monstrous metal entity tearing through the darkness. The air in the tunnel grew heavy, charged with an electric hum, and the very ground beneath his feet vibrated with an ominous power. He scrambled, his eyes darting frantically, searching for anything, any crevice, any escape from the inevitable collision. Then, through the flickering, inadequate light of his phone, he saw it. A small, rust-eaten maintenance access door, set into the concrete wall. It was meant to be locked, bolted shut, impenetrable. But in his desperation, fueled by a primal will to survive, he lunged, his fingers tearing at the handle. It rattled loose, then with a groan of metal, it gave way, swinging inward just enough to reveal a cramped, pitch-black cavity. He didn't hesitate. He squeezed through the narrow opening, his shoulder scraping painfully against the rough concrete, just as the express train roared past. The sheer force of the wind, the deafening shriek of metal on metal, the blinding flash of light from the windows, slammed against the door, threatening to tear it from its hinges. He pressed himself against the back wall of the tiny chamber, gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. The vibrations were immense, shaking his very bones, threatening to collapse the small space around him. The air was thick with the acrid smell of ozone and hot metal. It felt like an eternity, but then, as suddenly as it had come, the train was gone, leaving behind a ringing silence, punctuated only by the fading echo of its passage and Michael's ragged breaths. He was alive, for now, but the reprieve was short-lived. He heard footsteps approaching the access door, slow, deliberate, chillingly calm. "David." "Well, well, Michael," David's voice echoed, muffled by the door. "Always the resourceful one. Just like your old man." Michael pressed his back against the cold, damp wall, straining to hear, his grip tight on the flimsy door. He could feel David trying the handle, a soft click, then a persistent pushing. Michael braced himself, his muscles screaming, holding the door shut with all his might. "It's no use, Michael," David continued, his voice closer now, as if he was pressing his face against the metal. "You can't stay in there forever. And you certainly can't stop what's coming." "What do you want, David?" Michael hissed, his voice raw, barely a whisper. "What is all of this?" A low chuckle from the other side. "Patience, Michael. All in good time. But since you're so interested, let's talk. About your father. About Sarah. About everything you've been so desperately trying to uncover." Michael's blood ran cold. Sarah. David knew about Sarah. This wasn't just about a network, it was personal. "Your father, Thomas. He was a good man, Michael. A loyal man. For a while anyway." David's voice took on a falsely sympathetic tone. "He was one of us. He saw the potential, the efficiency, the way the city's veins could be used for something truly grand, truly profitable, beyond just moving people from one place to another. He was a conductor, Michael spat. He wouldn't be involved in whatever sick game you're playing, wouldn't he? David scoffed. He was involved. Deeply. He helped set up some of the key routes, the hidden access points, the ghost lines. He understood the system better than anyone. He was invaluable. Michael felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. His father, a part of this shadow network? The man he idolized, the man whose memory he was trying to honor? It couldn't be. But then, David's voice hardened. He started to get sentimental, started asking questions, saw things he shouldn't have seen, things that made him uncomfortable. He got cold feet, Michael. Thought he could just walk away. Thought he could expose us. Expose what, David? What is it you're doing down here? Michael demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and burgeoning rage. We're running a parallel economy, Michael. A discreet, efficient, and highly profitable operation. The tunnels are our highways. The abandoned stations are hubs. The old forgotten lines are express routes. We move valuable cargo, untraceable, unseen, and a few sensitive individuals who prefer to remain off the grid. The implications hit Michael like a physical blow. Sensitive individuals? You mean you're trafficking people, David? Is that what this is? Human beings. David laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Trafficking is such a crude word, Michael. We facilitate relocation. For a price. For those who want to disappear or for those who need to be disappeared. It's a service. A highly specialized, highly lucrative service. Michael finally understood. The strange cargo, the sudden disappearances, the hushed rumors among the old-timers. It wasn't just contraband, it was people. And Sarah, Michael choked out. The ghost passenger, she wasn't a ghost, was she? She was one of your victims. Ah, Sarah. David's voice was laced with a chilling amusement. Such a persistent little thing. She saw too much. She was meant to be one of the relocations, but she got spooked, tried to escape. And your father, he tried to help her. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. His father's accident. It wasn't an accident. He tried to help her, Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. And you killed him. You killed my father because he wouldn't let you hurt her. David sighed dramatically. Such a tragic hero. He got in the way, Michael. He became a liability. And in our line of work, liabilities are dealt with. His accident was a necessary measure to protect the network. And Sarah, well, she was a loose end. A very inconvenient loose end. Michael felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. His father, betrayed and murdered by his own colleague. Sarah, a victim of this monstrous enterprise. And David, standing on the other side of this flimsy door, gloating. You're a monster, David, Michael growled, his voice low and dangerous. Perhaps, David conceded, but a necessary one. And now, Michael, you're becoming a liability too. You've seen too much. You've dug too deep. You've even brought a journalist into this, haven't you? Jessica. A very foolish move. Michael's blood ran cold again. Jessica. She was in danger. He had put her in danger. But don't worry, David continued, his voice dripping with false concern. We'll make sure her story gets buried right alongside yours. And no one will ever know the truth. The network will continue to thrive unseen, unheard, beneath the very feet of the city. Michael knew he couldn't stay hidden. This cramped space was a tomb, not a sanctuary. He had to fight. For his father. For Sarah. For Jessica. He had to expose them. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his mind racing. He was trapped, cornered, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. He had his phone, his wits, and a burning desire for justice. David was confident, arrogant, believing he had Michael completely ensnared. That was his weakness. Michael suddenly released his grip on the door. He heard David stumble slightly on the other side, momentarily surprised. Michael then quickly twisted the handle, yanking the door open with a violent shove. David, caught off guard, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with surprise. Before David could recover, Michael burst out of the maintenance chamber, not towards the way he came, but further into the dark, desolate tunnel, a desperate, last-ditch gamble. He had to find another way out, another way to get help, to expose them. He ran, the sound of David's enraged shout echoing behind him, followed by the pounding of his heavy footsteps. The tunnel seemed endless, a gaping maw of darkness. He knew David was faster, stronger, and knew these tunnels intimately. But Michael had something David didn't: a survivor's desperate will, and the ghosts of his father and Sarah urging him on. He just needed one chance, one opening, one way to bring the light of truth into this suffocating darkness. The air grew heavy with the promise of discovery, or perhaps Michael's final breath. He moved, not with the panicked flight of a cornered animal, but with the calculated stealth of a predator who had finally understood his prey's patterns. David knew the secret passages, yes, but Michael knew the system. He knew the schedules, the maintenance protocols, the blind spots in the surveillance David thought he controlled. He knew the legacy of the subway, the parts that even David, in his hubris, might dismiss as irrelevant. Michael remembered his father's old tales, not just of the ghost train, but of the forgotten emergency exits, the ventilation shafts that led to street grades, the maintenance tunnels that ran parallel to active lines, rarely used but never truly decommissioned. David had built his empire in the shadows, but those shadows still existed within a larger, regulated world. That was Michael's leverage. He pressed himself against the cold, damp concrete, listening to David's heavy footsteps echo in the distance. David was getting closer, his taunts growing louder, laced with a chilling confidence. "You can't hide forever, Michael. This is my domain. You're just another rat in the maze." But Michael wasn't a rat. He was a conductor just like his father, and conductors knew how to navigate their tracks. He found a narrow, barely visible grate, rusted and stiff, hidden behind an old utility box. It was one of the emergency ventilation shafts, leading up to a discreet grate on a bustling city street, usually locked from the outside. But Michael remembered a trick his father showed him: a specific sequence of jolts and a twist to dislodge the internal locking mechanism, a relic from a time before digital security. He worked quickly, silently, as David's footsteps grew ominously close. The metal groaned under his strain, each creak a potential death knell. He felt David's presence, an icy dread creeping up his spine. David was just around the bend, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Michael pushed one last time, and with a metallic shriek, the grate gave way, swinging inward just enough for a man to squeeze through. He didn't escape. Not yet. This wasn't about escape, it was about exposure. He carefully positioned his phone, its camera recording, aimed directly at the opening, hoping to catch David in the act, hoping to capture something. He knew the signal would be weak, but if he could just get a burst of data out, even a fragmented image or audio clip. He then slipped back into the main tunnel, not fleeing but circling. He knew David would see the open grate. He wanted David to see it. It would confirm Michael's escape route, drawing David towards the opening, towards the potential for light, and towards the trap Michael was setting. David reached the grate, his triumphant laugh echoing. "Trying to run, are we? Pathetic. You think you can escape my tunnels?" He peered through the opening, momentarily distracted, his back to Michael. This was it. Michael seized the moment. He burst from the shadows, a rusted pipe he'd found earlier clutched in his hand. He didn't aim to kill, but to disable. He struck David's flashlight, sending it clattering to the ground, plunging them into near-total darkness. David roared in surprise and fury. "You think darkness is your ally, Michael? I was born in it, molded by it." David's voice was a guttural growl, his movements surprisingly swift. He lunged, a glint of metal in his hand, a heavy wrench he kept for emergencies. Michael ducked, the wrench whistling past his ear. He wasn't as big as David, but he was quicker, fueled by adrenaline and years of navigating tight spaces. He dodged another swing, then another, the metallic clang echoing eerily. He knew he couldn't beat David in a prolonged brawl. He needed to create a distraction, an opening for the truth to emerge. He remembered the old, disused signal box, just a few yards from the grate. It controlled a derelict spur line, a dead end, but its power supply was still connected to the main grid. A crazy idea formed, born of desperation. Michael feigned a retreat, drawing David further into the tunnel, away from the grate. "You killed them, didn't you, David? My father, Sarah. All for your twisted game." David's laugh was chilling. "Game? This isn't a game, Michael. This is survival. Your father was getting too close. He saw things he shouldn't. Sarah, well, she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, asking too many questions about the ghost train and its cargo. A shame, really. She was pretty." Rage flared in Michael, eclipsing his fear. He spun not towards David but towards the signal box. David, momentarily surprised by Michael's sudden change in direction, hesitated. That was all Michael needed. He smashed the old pipe against the signal box's rusted casing, forcing it open. Wires sparked, a faint hum filled the air. He knew the risk, the jolt of high voltage, but he had to try. He grabbed a handful of exposed wires, ignoring the painful static shock, and twisted them together, creating a short circuit. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Lights flickered erratically down the tunnel, then died completely. The hum of distant machinery ceased. The entire section of the tunnel went silent, plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. And then, a series of klaxons began to blare, piercing the silence, emergency alarms triggered by the system-wide power failure in that section. "What have you done?" David shrieked, disoriented by the sudden darkness and the deafening alarms. Michael didn't answer. He was already moving, his eyes adjusting faster than David's. He knew the layout of the old tracks, the loose ties, the unstable sections. He led David on a desperate chase, the blare of the alarms growing louder, more insistent. He led David directly towards the open emergency grate, not to escape, but to draw him into the light. David, blinded by the alarms and the darkness, stumbled, cursing. Michael saw his chance. He aimed his kick, not at David, but at a stack of old, corroded metal crates David had carefully hidden behind a crumbling pillar. The crates, revealed by the faint, pulsing emergency lights now struggling to function, split open upon impact. Inside, not the usual contraband of electronics or drugs, but something far more chilling. Bundles of what looked like counterfeit currency meticulously packaged, alongside several plastic-wrapped packages of what appeared to be raw, uncut diamonds, glinting dully in the dim light. And hidden beneath them, a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with cryptic entries and dates, some of which Michael recognized as the dates of his father's and Sarah's disappearances. This wasn't just smuggling. It was a high-stakes, international operation, and the ghost train was its untraceable artery. "No, my work. You fool!" David screamed, abandoning his pursuit of Michael, scrambling to cover the spilled contents. Just then, sirens began to wail in the distance, growing rapidly closer. The short circuit Michael had caused wasn't just a local power outage. It had triggered a system-wide alert, flagging a critical breach in an abandoned section of the tunnels. The emergency grate, now open to the street above, was providing a direct conduit for the sound, and for access. Footsteps pounded from above, followed by shouts. "Police! Anyone down there?" Michael, gasping for breath, stood over the exposed crates, his face streaked with sweat and grime, but a grim satisfaction settling in his eyes. "He's here. And he has company," Michael yelled back, his voice hoarse but clear, pointing a trembling finger at David, who was frantically trying to shove the evidence back into the broken crates. David looked up, his face a mask of primal fury and despair. He knew it was over. His empire of shadows, built on fear and deception, was crumbling around him. He made one last desperate lunge, not at Michael, but at the journal, as if to destroy the final piece of evidence. But Michael was faster, snatching it away just as the first police officers rappelled down the shaft, their flashlights cutting through the gloom like avenging angels. The tunnel was suddenly alive with shouts, the glare of tactical lights, and the clatter of boots. David was quickly subdued, struggling violently, still snarling accusations at Michael. "You ruined everything. You don't understand the power I wielded." Michael stood quietly, the journal clutched in his hand, watching as David, the architect of his family's pain, was led away in cuffs. The ghost train had been nothing more than a meticulously crafted illusion, a horrifying smokescreen for a vast criminal enterprise that had used the city's forgotten arteries for its illicit heart. The ghosts were not supernatural entities, but the victims of David's ruthless ambition, people like Michael's father and Sarah, who had stumbled upon the truth and paid the ultimate price. Later, as the sun finally broke through the city skyline, casting long golden shadows over the very streets Michael had just emerged from, he sat with Detective Miller. The journal was damning, detailing dates, transactions, and chillingly, the removal of loose ends, Michael's father, John, and Sarah among them. David had orchestrated their deaths, making them look like accidents or disappearances, using the ghost train myth to deter any serious investigation into the specific sections of the tunnel where his operations were based. He had even manipulated evidence, creating digital anomalies to reinforce the supernatural narrative. He used the city's fear, Michael, Detective Miller said, shaking his head. The legend of the ghost train, the disappearances, he cultivated it, amplified it, turned it into his perfect cover. Everyone was looking for a ghost, when they should have been looking for a criminal mastermind. Michael nodded slowly, the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. The ghosts of his father and Sarah were not gone, but they were no longer tormented. They had found their peace, their truth brought into the light. The subway, an intricate labyrinth of steel and concrete, had once been a place of terror and sorrow for him. Now it was simply a testament to the city's ceaseless pulse, a place where stories both dark and bright continued to unfold. He looked back towards the subway entrance, feeling the rumble of a passing train deep beneath his feet. The city continued, oblivious to the silent battle that had just been won in its underbelly. The ghost train would fade back into urban legend, but this time, its truth would be known to those who